The boardroom was empty now. The long oak table, polished to a dull shine, reflected nothing but the shadows of late afternoon. At the far end sat Charles Whitman, not the commanding CEO who once filled the room with certainty, not the man whose voice could sway markets, but a tired figure, bent slightly forward, his hands folded, his eyes resting on nothing in particular. The chair beside him was vacant. That was the seat where she once waited for him. Lila Hayes, the woman who had entered his life with laughter and light, and who now carried the blame for everything that had unraveled. Her perfume still lingered faintly in his memory, though the room itself smelled only of paper and stale coffee. Outside, traffic moved as it always had. The city was unchanged. But inside Charles, silence roared. Stock prices had dropped. Shareholders had called for his resignation. Colleagues who once toasted to his health now whispered behind closed doors. And yet none of that weighed heavier than the simple absence of her voice. He glanced toward the photograph on the credenza. A moment captured their wedding day. His gray hair against her youthful glow. The image that had set the whispers in motion, that had grown into headlines, that had turned into a storm too vast to control. The photograph seemed almost cruel now, a reminder not just of love, but of how love had been twisted into scandal. Charles closed his eyes. He breathed slowly. The kind of breath a man takes when he knows there are no battles left to win, only memories left to sort through. The question hung in the silence, unspoken but sharp. How did it come to this? And so, as the light in the room dimmed and shadows reached for him, Charles Whitman let his mind drift backward. Not with urgency, not with anger, but with the weight of a story that had to be remembered, slowly, carefully, like a scar traced by memory. It began with a single image, a wedding portrait, shared first among friends, then drifting quietly into the wider world. Charles Whitman stood tall, dignified, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of his young bride. Lila Hayes glowed beside him, her white dress carrying the light in a way that made her seem untouchable. At first, the photograph lived where all wedding photos live, in scrapbooks, on mantelpieces, in the warmth of memory. But soon it crossed into places neither of them had imagined. Business magazines ran it as a curiosity. Tabloids latched onto the age gap, 32 years. That number was repeated more times than their names. Love knows no age, some wrote in defense. But more often, the words were less forgiving. Power imbalance, corporate risk, a scandal waiting to happen. The headlines multiplied like weeds in a garden that had once been carefully tended. Charles read them at his desk, his jaw set. For a man who had spent decades mastering the art of reputation, this was a new kind of battlefield. His business achievements were suddenly footnotes to a marriage the world insisted on dissecting. Lila tried to smile through it. She scrolled past the articles, told herself it was noise, that what mattered was the life they had together. Yet even as she sat across from him at dinner, her hand brushing his on the table, she felt the weight of eyes she could not see. The photograph had been taken to mark joy, but in the quiet of those early weeks, it became something else, a symbol, a wedge, a mirror in which everyone seemed determined to find what they wanted to see: scandal, betrayal, ambition, folly. And for Charles Whitman, the question was no longer if the storm would pass, but how much of himself it would strip away when it did. The office had once been his sanctuary. Polished floors, framed awards, the low murmur of meetings that always carried his name. But now, even the air in the hallways seemed heavier. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Smiles that had once greeted him now carried a stiffness, as though loyalty itself had gone brittle. Charles Whitman was used to whispers. In business, there were always doubts, always second-guessing. But these whispers carried a different tone. They were not about quarterly forecasts or mergers. They were about her, about Lila Hayes. "Did you see the way she sat in on that meeting?" one voice murmured in the cafeteria. "She doesn't belong there," another replied. "She hasn't earned it." The words floated through corridors, carried on the shuffle of papers, hidden behind polite nods. Charles told himself he didn't care. He told himself his authority was unshaken. But late at night, when the office was quiet and the city lights blinked beyond the glass, he would catch his reflection in the window and wonder if they were right. Lila, too, felt it. When she passed through the lobby, the receptionist's smile seemed thinner. When she attended a charity dinner, women her age avoided her, while older men leaned in too close, asking questions with a smirk. She felt both invisible and exposed, a paradox that exhausted her. At home, she tried to share this with Charles. He listened, nodded, assured her that time would mend it. But his words carried the weight of strategy, not comfort. He was a man who solved problems. She was a woman who longed for understanding. The distance between those two needs grew with every whisper they could not silence. And though the walls of Whitman Enterprises stood tall, within them something fragile had begun to crack. Lila Hayes had never imagined her life would become a headline. She had grown up with simpler dreams, long walks in autumn, a home filled with laughter, the kind of love that made a woman feel safe. She found some of that with Charles Whitman. In his presence, she felt seen, cherished, as though her youth did not make her small but gave him back something he thought he had lost. Yet now, every kindness between them was being rewritten by strangers. A hand on her back became evidence of manipulation. A smile at a gala became ambition. Even her silence was judged, interpreted as calculation. At night, Lila stood by the bedroom window, watching the city lights blur through her reflection. She thought of her friends, the ones who had stopped calling. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone, hesitant, worried. "Are you sure about this, Lila?" And she thought of Charles, asleep in the bed behind her, a man burdened by a world that wanted to see him fall. She loved him. She did. But love, she was learning, was not always enough to quiet the noise outside. She tried to write in her journal, hoping words on paper might steady her heart. Instead, the pages filled with questions she could not answer. Was she strong enough for this? Was he? Could love survive when every glance, every gesture was twisted into scandal? In the stillness, she whispered his name, though he could not hear it. Charles Whitman. A name that carried power in public but felt so tender in her private voice. The world had taken their story and painted it in its own colors. But inside, in the quiet, she still held on to the truth, that she had not married a CEO. She had married a man, and it was that man she feared losing to the storm around them. The boardroom had changed. Once a place of triumph, it now bristled with unease. Around the long table sat men and women who had stood with Charles Whitman through expansions, acquisitions, and financial storms. Yet now, their eyes carried something colder. They didn't speak of love, they spoke of risk. "Perception matters," one said, her voice clipped, careful. "Stockholders are nervous," another added, tapping his pen against the folder before him. "The marriage has become a distraction," a third concluded, letting the word distraction linger like a verdict. Charles listened. His face remained calm, but inside he felt the sting of betrayal. These were colleagues who had toasted his victories, who had leaned on his judgment when the company was threatened. Now, they weighed his personal life against the balance sheets. Lila's name was mentioned without her presence. Mrs. Hayes, rarely Lila, almost never Whitman. She was reduced to a risk factor, a liability line on a corporate ledger. Charles wanted to rise, to remind them of his record, his years of loyalty, the empires he had built with them at his side. But when he opened his mouth, the words felt heavy. What defense could stand against suspicion once it had taken root? At the end of the meeting, the board chair leaned forward. "We are watching closely, Charles, for your sake and for the company's." The room emptied, the door closed. And for the first time in his career, Charles Whitman felt less like a leader and more like a man on trial. At home that evening, he didn't speak of it to Lila. He poured himself a drink, stared at the amber liquid, and sat in silence. She watched him from across the room, her heart aching at the distance that kept growing. A distance not of miles, but of trust, fear, and the uneasy eyes of those who once believed in him. The morning paper used to be a comfort for Charles Whitman, a routine, a way of measuring the world before stepping into it. But now, every headline felt like a blade. Whitman marriage raises questions of corporate ethics. Is love blinding the CEO? Scandal or simply poor judgment? The words were printed in black ink, but to Charles they might as well have been carved into stone. His achievements, decades of careful leadership, resilience through crises, building a company that employed thousands, had been reduced to footnotes beneath his photograph with Lila Hayes. He tried to shrug it off. He told himself that markets were fickle, that news cycles were short. But as he sat at the breakfast table, the silence between him and Lila grew louder with each page turned. She stirred her coffee, her eyes fixed on the cup. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered once. Charles didn't answer. He couldn't, because he hadn't asked for it either. And yet here they were, their love rewritten by strangers who never knew them. Lila stopped going out as often. Invitations dried up anyway. Where once she had been greeted with smiles at fundraisers, now she received cautious glances. Her name carried weight. but not the kind she wanted. To some, she was opportunist. To others, victim. Rarely was she seen as simply Lila Hayes, a young woman who loved an older man. At night, she scrolled through the articles on her phone, even when Charles told her not to. "It doesn't matter," he said. But it did, because every line, every opinion, chipped away at the simple joy that had brought her into his life. And somewhere in the quiet, they both began to wonder. If the world refused to see love, could love still stand on its own? The mansion that once echoed with warmth began to feel like a shell. Behind closed doors, Charles Whitman and Lila Hayes lived in a silence neither of them had chosen. The days were filled with strategy meetings and endless phone calls. The nights, with unanswered questions. Charles would sit in his leather chair, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring into the fireplace, as though flames might burn away the doubt. Lila paced the hallway, restless, her footsteps the only sound in a house that had grown too large for comfort. They tried, at times, to bridge the gap. Charles would place a hand over hers at dinner. Lila would lean her head against his shoulder on the sofa. But even in these moments, the storm outside seeped in. A phone would buzz, an email would arrive. Another headline would remind them of what others believed. "I miss us," she said softly one night, her voice nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. He looked at her, tired but tender. "We're still here." But were they? Because the distance was not just in words, but in the way they carried themselves. She felt the weight of being his liability. He felt the burden of protecting her in a world that refused to forgive. And in that house, filled with luxury but stripped of ease, love had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like a test neither of them had prepared for. The annual shareholder meeting had always been Charles Whitman's stage, a chance to stand tall, to remind everyone why they trusted him. But this year the air was different. The auditorium filled with the low hum of investors, their conversations clipped, their gazes sharp. Cameras lined the back wall, waiting. At the edge of the stage, Lila Hayes sat quietly, her presence both a comfort and a target. Charles delivered his report with precision. Numbers, growth forecasts, the language of leadership. But it was not enough. A man in the front row rose, his voice loud, his question sharper than any financial concern. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "are you running a corporation or indulging in a romance that puts all of us at risk?" The words struck like thunder. Gasps rippled through the room. Charles hesitated, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the cameras turned toward her. Lila's face flushed. In that instant, she was no longer a wife but a symbol, an object of speculation broadcast across the country. Her hands trembled. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and left the room without a word. The cameras followed her exit. Headlines were already being written, and for Charles Whitman, the breaking point was not the question asked, nor the shareholders' doubt, but the look on her face as she walked away. A look that said she could no longer bear the weight of being his scandal. The board gathered one final time. The air was thick with inevitability. Resignation, though not yet spoken, was already written between the lines of every document on the table. Charles Whitman sat at the head of the room. His suit was impeccable, his posture steady, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man who had given too much. The chairwoman spoke first. Her words were careful, almost sympathetic. "For the stability of the company, Charles, we believe it's time." He nodded slowly. There was no fight left in him. He had fought markets, competitors, crises of every shape, but he could not fight perception. He could not fight whispers. When the meeting adjourned, he lingered alone in the room. He let his hand rest on the smooth wood of the table, remembering the countless decisions made there. The victories, the setbacks, the legacy, all now overshadowed by one choice of the heart. At home that night, he found Lila in the garden, sitting quietly among the roses. She looked up at him, her eyes searching. "It's done," he said simply. She reached for his hand. For a moment they said nothing. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It carried sorrow, but also something gentler. The recognition that what they had shared was real, even if the world refused to see it. The mansion was quieter now. No more frantic calls, no more reporters at the gate, just silence. Charles Whitman sat in his study, the photograph of their wedding still on the credenza. He did not move it. He did not hide it. For all it had cost him, it was still a moment of truth, a memory of joy untouched by scandal. Lila Hayes moved softly through the house, her presence lighter, less burdened by scrutiny. She no longer checked the papers. She no longer scrolled through articles. The world had moved on to other stories, as it always did. But for her, and for him, the echoes remained. Some would remember him as the CEO who fell to scandal. Others would say he had been blinded by love. But in the stillness of their private world, what remained was simpler. Two people who had tried to hold on to each other in a storm too vast to control. Love does not always conquer. Sometimes it survives in quieter ways. In the glance across a table, in the hand that still reaches, even when the world has judged it harshly. And so, as the evening sun stretched long shadows across the room, Charles Whitman closed his eyes. He thought not of boardrooms or headlines, but of the sound of her laughter on that first day they met. That, above all, was what he chose to keep. In the end, what remained was not the scandal, nor the headlines, nor the whispers in the boardroom. What lingered was quieter. A man who gave decades to his company, and a woman who offered him love when the world least expected it. Charles Whitman's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest cost of love is not in losing it, but in carrying it when others refuse to understand. And perhaps that is where his legacy truly lives. Not in the rise and fall of markets, but in the tender truth that, even when love is questioned, it leaves behind echoes too deep to be erased. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Charles Whitman's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Charles Whitman's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.